Hello. Today I'm going to be showing you a technique to transfer an image, a simple drawing, from a photograph to a larger sheet of paper. So we're going to have a couple of steps. We're going to start by tracing it with tracing paper to get a reproduction of the photograph and decide where we want our drawing to be. Our second step, we're going to transfer that tracing paper drawing onto a larger sheet. We're doing an enlargement. We'll be using a grid for that. And then we're going to use a graphite transfer technique to transfer that larger drawing on the gridded paper to a clean sheet of watercolor paper. And the reason for that step is to get rid of that grid so that it's not in there, so we don't have to worry about cleaning it up later. So this process will take us from having a photograph that we're using for reference to having a line drawing of whatever complexity we want on our watercolor paper before we start the watercolor process. It's a really good way to sort of get a drawing from a photograph without having a ton of technical drawing skills. So it's kind of a good intermittent step between just drawing from the photograph and just starting out. Okay, so I'll walk you through the process. So we're going to start with a reference photograph. In this case it's going to be 8 inches by 10 inches. It's important that we have the right scale so that when we enlarge it later we have something that's proportional. So from my photograph here, I'm going to take a sheet of tracing paper and place it on top of the photograph. So I'm going to start by taping it down to hold it still. And then I'm going to place the tracing paper on top. You can see I can see the photograph quite clearly through there. I'm going to tape the tracing paper down to keep both the photograph and the tracing paper from shifting during the drawing process, which can give me a drawing that's off. So at this point I'm going to kind of decide how much detail I want to get. Depending on how meticulous I want to be and how much help I want later when I'm painting, I can do more or less detail. I'm just going to kind of get the basic outlines and guidelines for my drawing, my eventual watercolor. But you can really get in there and get any level of detail you want. It just takes a little longer. The advantage to it is, of course, you have it there later, so it makes your job a little easier later on in the process. So I'm going to go ahead and fast forward through this, but I'm basically just going to capture the edges I want to capture with my pencil. So now we'll speed this up. I just continue to fill in the line drawing here, getting whatever level of detail I want. And next we're going to draw a grid on the tracing paper. So I'm getting on my ruler here. I want to mark every inch. So to get a straight grid I want to do it on both sides. So I want to start on the left hand side and I'm going to move over to the right. And then I'll mark every inch and connect those. It should give me a nice straight line, and if I do the same thing on the top and the bottom, it should give me a nice even grid. And then after I've got my nice even grid there, 1 inch by 1 inch, I'm going to label my rows and columns with letters and numbers. So we'll speed this up and you can see that happen here. Filling in the grid, getting that all connected. Again, it's really important to make sure I start at the same edge and I line up my 0 on my ruler to get everything nice and square and even so that it all lines up and I've got a perfect grid. Okay, so next I'm going to do a transfer. So I'm going to get a larger sheet of paper that I'm going to transfer this to. So the larger sheet of paper is going to be 12 inches by 15 inches. So each side is 1.5 times my tracing paper here. So I'm going to bring that back out. Oh, see, now I'm taping my tracing paper to the back of my photo so that I can see the line drawing really clearly without seeing the photo through. And you label the rows and columns with letters and numbers to help you figure out which box you're working in. So now I'm going to make my graph on my bigger paper. Like I said, this one's larger. It's 1.5 times on each side. So I'll be making my marks every 1.5 inches. So I'll start with 1.5, and then 3, 4.5, 6, 7.5, 9, etc. And I'll make all my measurement marks and then connect them together to make a large grid again, and I'll label the rows and columns. So now I begin the tedious work of transferring my tracing here onto my larger sheet using the grid here. I just basically have to go through square by square and draw the lines as I see them. I want to pay really close attention to where the lines intersect the grid. I don't want to look and see where it intersects and say, you know, is this halfway between these two lines on the grid, or is it a quarter, is it a third? I want to try to get those intersections in the right place. And then I want to try to match the places where they intersect using the correct curvature of line. So I want to go slowly through this to get my drawing as accurate as possible. It's really important that we have accuracy in this step. It's going to determine how accurate our final version is. After I've enlarged my line drawing using my grid, I'm going to use a technique called a graphite transfer to transfer my line drawing from my grid sheet here onto my watercolor paper. So here's my watercolor paper. I want to transfer that line drawing onto it. So this works a little bit like carbon paper, if you've ever used that, if you've ever used that to write a receipt or had a receipt written that way. What I'm going to do, I'm going to take the back of my drawing here that I drew my line drawing on with the grid on it, and I'm going to use a block of graphite, and I'm going to cover the entire back with as much graphite as I can. The more I get on here, the easier the transfer is going to be, the easier it'll be to see. My transfer is going to end up being pretty light, so if you use more graphite than I did, you'll have something a little darker. It'll be a little easier to work with. You can use all sorts of materials to use these kind of transfers. You can use charcoal, you can use chalk pastel, just kind of depending on what you want. The graphite works really well, and it's kind of fairly easy to erase and not too dark, so it's a good choice. But you can use any variety of things, kind of depending on what you're going to be doing over it. So now I'm going to take this piece of paper and tape it down. Again, this is so I don't shift. In this case, my watercolor paper is a little bit smaller than my drawing, so I have to make a decision about what part of my drawing I don't want to have in my final watercolor painting. I've kind of edited out the sky a little bit, so I've taped my watercolor paper a little bit down from the top of my drawing. So now what I have to do is I have to go through and retrace all the lines that I drew. So if I have a really complex drawing, this makes it a little trickier. If it's simple, it's pretty easy. So I want to try to draw in a way that makes it clear to me where I've drawn before. So I want to draw darkly. That'll make it easier for me to tell how much of the drawing I've already copied. That'll also get me a nice transfer as I go through. So I've actually ended up with a pretty light transfer, you can see here. So I'm going to go ahead and draw over the lines that I've transferred onto here, just so I don't smudge them too much to be able to see them, just so I can kind of see them as I'm painting. With my watercolor, I do want to eventually kind of get rid of these lines, so I do want to be able to erase them. I don't want to draw too darkly, but going over them again is a good idea so that I can see them, and if I rub them or smudge them, they don't get totally erased by my hand. So here's my finished drawing, and I've got a tracing paper, enlargement, and transfer.